candlelight trembled against the cold stone walls of the royal chamber, casting shadows that hid far darker truths. Beyond the thick oak doors, muffled sobs mingled with laughter, the kind that echoed from pleasure forced, not given. Servants moved like ghosts through the corridors, forbidden to speak, yet burdened by the secrets of their king's midnight rituals. King John Plantagenet ruled England not with wisdom or justice, but with appetite, raw, unrestrained, and cruel. He wore his crown like armor, but used his lust as a weapon, a means to dominate rather than desire. The same hand that signed royal decrees also tore silk gowns from terrified noblewomen summoned to his chambers. In the court of John, no vow, no marriage, and no holy order was sacred enough to stop him. The chronicles of England whispered his name with dread, not for his wars, but for his perversions. Even the priests who blessed his meals avoided his gaze, fearful they too might become instruments of humiliation. Royal banquets ended not with prayers but with demands, women chosen, stripped of virtue, and renamed gifts of loyalty. In an age where sin was measured by the church, John's excesses mocked both heaven and earth. He turned the sanctity of marriage into a theatre of control, binding women as trophies in his silent war on nobility. To refuse him was treason, to obey him was disgrace. There was no safety, only surrender. When the young Isabella of Angoulême entered his life, England witnessed not a royal wedding, but an abduction sanctified by ceremony. She was 12, trembling beneath the crown, her innocence traded for an alliance and the king's insatiable pleasure. Rumours spread like wildfire, of noble brides stolen, of nuns defiled, of enemies' wives made to kneel in submission. Yet none dared speak openly. The king's spies moved faster than whispers, and silence became survival. In the eyes of his court, lust had become law, and England's morality, its first casualty. Behind his smirk and jewelled rings hid a predator who believed divinity excused desire. His bedchamber was both a throne and a battlefield, where obedience was measured in broken vows and stolen breath. Chroniclers later called him the English. Nero, a ruler who burned decency for pleasure and loyalty for lust. Even the stone walls of his castles seemed to absorb the screams, relics of sin masquerading as royal grandeur. What began as indulgence soon became tyranny, a legacy written not in ink, but in the suffering of women. And as the kingdom trembled under his rule, one question echoed in the dark. How far could desire corrupt a crown? For King John, intimacy was not affection. It was conquest, the purest expression of dominion over flesh and will. He ruled not only through soldiers and taxes, but through the fear that lived in women's eyes. Every seduction was a political act, every embrace a silent declaration that no soul in England was untouchable. In his world, consent was irrelevant, only obedience mattered, and desire was forced to kneel before authority. The king's mistresses were not chosen for beauty, but for their husband's loyalty, their father's influence, their silence. When John called for a nobleman's wife, refusal was treason, and submission was the only survival. Chroniclers described how women arrived to his chambers trembling, their jewels stripped first, their dignity next. He rewarded compliance with estates and punished rejection with exile, imprisonment, or whispered accusations of witchcraft. His lust was never just lust. It was strategy, a way to humiliate the proud and break the defiant. Each conquered lover was a message to the court. No lineage, no marriage, no priest could protect you. He transformed pleasure into policy, weaving his desires into the fabric of statecraft. Through bedchambers and betrayals, he learned that power could be sustained longer through shame than through fear. The wives of rivals became his leverage, their bodies ransom for political obedience. He used desire as a weapon sharper than any sword, wounding honor deeper than blood ever could. When his barons revolted, they carried not only resentment, but humiliation, their pride crushed by the king's touch. John's reign proved that tyranny could be sensual, cruelty could wear the perfume of intimacy. In his private letters, lust and politics blurred, promises of pardon scrawled beside commands of submission. Even the clergy feared him, for he turned confession into corruption, tempting priests with forbidden absolutions. The church preached chastity, but John turned sin into a spectacle, mocking divine law with every stolen kiss. He made virtue a commodity, purity a lie, and loyalty the most intimate of currencies. To rule a man's wife was to rule the man. To shame his bloodline was to own his future. He was not content with obedience. He wanted reverence born from degradation. Those who served him learned that pleasure was punishment in disguise, and love was the language of control. Beneath his crown, England's tyrant found his truest power not in the throne, but in the trembling of others. And through that trembling, the kingdom itself began to rot, from the silken sheets outward, into every soul it touched. In the summer of 1200, King John saw her, a child barely 12, promised to another, yet marked for his desire. Isabella of Angoulême was to wed Hugh de Lusignan, but John saw her beauty as his divine entitlement. Within weeks, he tore her from her betrothed, claiming her as queen in a ceremony drenched in sin. The wedding was swift, the vows whispered under duress, and the church's silence purchased with gold and intimidation. For England, it was an alliance. For France, an outrage. For Isabella, a nightmare she could never wake from. The chroniclers called it love, but the truth reeked of possession. A royal abduction masked as matrimony. Hugh de Lusignan's humiliation became legend, his vengeance igniting the flames of rebellion that would engulf John's fragile crown. The abduction of a bride set nations ablaze. Normandy lost, vassals broken, England plunged into diplomatic ruin. But in John's eyes, the chaos was worth it. He had what he wanted, and that was power. Witnesses recalled her tears beneath the veil, her silence mistaken for obedience, the first lie of her reign. She was paraded as a queen, but treated as a prize, her crown a shackle forged in the heat of lust. John's courtiers toasted the marriage, but beneath their laughter lay fear, for they knew the girl was a captive. He kept her close, not out of love, but paranoia, fearing the return of every man he had wronged. Isabella's every movement was watched, her letters censored, her chambers guarded by men loyal only to the king's appetite. Chroniclers dared not record her suffering in detail. Even ink trembled at the thought of what transpired behind those doors. Whispers told of nights filled with screams, muffled by pillows, of servants dismissed for seeing too much. The queen's beauty became her curse, the source of both her influence and her imprisonment. When the French king demanded justice, John mocked him, calling Isabella the jewel that crowned my conquest. His arrogance sealed his fate. France declared war, and England's pride began its long, humiliating decay. The abduction of one girl had shifted the axis of power in Europe, lust rewriting the course of empires. Behind the pageantry of royal weddings and treaties lay the truth. England's monarch had unleashed ruin for the sake of desire. John's enemies multiplied not by armies, but by whispers. Every nobleman now feared for his daughters. Even within his court, loyalty faltered, for men who served him by day cursed him in prayer by night. And still, Isabella endured, silent, haunted, a queen forged in the furnace of violation. Her eyes, once soft, hardened into mirrors of the tyranny that made her. Innocence had long since bled into history. John's palace became a theatre of temptation, where loyalty was measured not by honour, but by who dared resist him. He discovered that fear could rule nations, but lust could rule men, more quietly, more efficiently, more eternally. Every affair, every rumour, every sigh behind silk curtains became a weapon sharpened by his cunning. The wives of barons became his spies. Mistresses carried secrets between sheets and council chambers. Alike, he promised freedom to prisoners if their daughters would visit his private hall to plead for mercy. His cruelty was not impulsive, it was calculated, each seduction serving a political purpose wrapped in scandal. He once seduced the sister of a rival lord, only to parade her shame at a royal feast. Through humiliation, he broke the nobility more effectively than any sword or tax ever could. Court life under John was an endless masquerade, perfume and poison, velvet and betrayal intertwined. Even priests whispered of his excesses, Yet none dared confront the man who owned their salvation through confession. He learned the art of blackmail through desire, keeping letters, tokens, and witnesses as silent instruments of obedience. Bishops begged him to repent, but John replied that repentance was for those too weak to enjoy sin. The legend of Matilda Fitzwalter soon spread, the noblewoman who refused him and paid for it with her life. Poisoned wine silenced her defiance, but her name became a ghost that haunted his reputation forever. Her story transformed in folklore into Maid Marian, the maiden defying tyranny, born from a murdered woman's silence. Each scandal deepened his isolation. The very women he enslaved became symbols of rebellion whispered in taverns. Foreign ambassadors recorded the king's court as a brothel under a crown where loyalty ended at dawn, he mocked. Marriage as a chain for fools, preferring the thrill of taking what others held sacred. Noblemen came to dread invitations to court, knowing their wives might return broken or not at all. Every seduction fractured alliances, his lust reshaping England's political map more than any treaty ever could. The Pope himself condemned John's debauchery, excommunicating him for sins both spiritual and carnal. Yet the king revelled in his damnation, calling himself the wolf that preys only on pleasure. His vices no longer hid behind curtains. They strutted proudly through his court, as if corruption were divine right. Even his most loyal knights began to flinch at his laughter, sensing the madness that fed beneath desire. England's throne had become a harem of control, a place where pleasure-served policy and morality was a corpse. In the end, the seducer ruled only ashes, his realm of lust decaying into revolt and whispered vengeance. Beyond the palace gates, England groaned beneath a silence thicker than fog and twice as dangerous. The people sang ballads in whispers, songs of a king who devoured virtue like bread at his table. Taverns echoed with nervous laughter, for even jokes about the king's lust could summon the hangman's noose. Peasants believed his sins had cursed the land, bringing famine, storms, and the plague of endless war. The poor suffered for his pleasures, taxed to fund feasts where wine flowed thicker than their children's blood. To the common man, royalty was no longer divine, it was diseased, dripping with corruption and desire. Women in villages prayed not for love, but for invisibility, lest the king's men see them. Marriage became fear, virginity became burden, and purity was the only armor left against royal appetite. The church preached chastity louder than ever, its sermons trembling between morality and hypocrisy. Priests condemned lust in public, yet confessed their own sins in private, often to the same courtiers they accused. In monasteries, whispers spread that England's suffering was divine punishment for the king's unholy lusts. Chroniclers who dared write the truth hid their manuscripts behind altar stones, fearing royal reprisal among nobles. Virtue became a performance, chastity rings, modest gowns, and vows worn like armor against suspicion. Yet the same nobles bribed their way into royal favor, trading their daughters for lands and titles. Commoners mocked the hypocrisy, calling the court heaven's brothel, where sin was currency and shame was tax. Women of the court learned to smile through terror, to turn survival into a graceful act. Some used seduction as rebellion, wielding their beauty against the men who sought to cage them. The line between victim and conspirator blurred. Desire became politics, and innocence became a dangerous myth. Children born of these secret liaisons were hidden in monasteries, their royal blood a lifelong curse. England's folktales began to twist, replacing saints with sinners, and kings with devils in crowns. Mothers warned daughters of the golden beast, a monarch whose kisses burned like brands upon the soul. Yet despite the moral decay, the court continued to glitter, its sin masked by silk and ceremony. Every feast was a ritual of denial, nobles drinking away their disgust, priests blessing poison with trembling hands. The peasants watched from afar, knowing their lives would pay for every drop of the king's indulgence. What began as scandal among nobles had now poisoned the nation's conscience, breeding cynicism deeper than any wound. In England's fields, among those who prayed in mud and silence, the legend of the cursed king was born. By 1215, the echoes of pleasure had turned to whispers of rebellion that even John could no longer silence. His chambers, once alive with feasts and laughter, now reeked of sickness, betrayal, and fear disguised as loyalty. Every face at court looked like a ghost of someone he had wronged, and there were many. The mistresses he flaunted began vanishing, their fates erased by silence, their names scratched out of chronicles. England itself seemed to reject him. Crops failed, storms raged, and barons sharpened swords in candlelit halls. The church declared him cursed, a monarch whose lust had damned not only his soul but his kingdom. He laughed in defiance, yet the laughter broke often, as if haunted by screams only he could hear. At night he drank alone, staring into goblets as though wine might drown memory or wash away sin. Even his courtiers avoided his gaze, for behind those bloodshot eyes lay the madness of isolation. Letters arrived sealed with rebellion. Nobles demanding justice, priests demanding penance, and widows demanding vengeance. He ignored them all, retreating deeper into self-indulgence, a man clinging to lust because it was the only power left. When word spread that the barons marched against him, he summoned soldiers, but few came. Loyalty had rotted away. The very nobles whose wives he had defiled now rode together beneath banners of vengeance and righteousness. Their cause was not only liberty but revenge, born from years of humiliation in the king's own bedchambers. John called them traitors, yet in truth they were victims who had finally remembered their dignity. The rebellion swelled until it surrounded him like judgment, forcing him to confront the sins that had built his throne. He met them not with courage, but with bribes, oaths, and trembling hands stained by pleasure and fear. At Runnymede, beneath grey skies, he signed the Magna Carta, not out of wisdom, but exhaustion and shame. Each stroke of the quill felt like confession, each clause a monument to the women and men he had destroyed. He had ruled through lust. Now lust had devoured his rule, leaving only ashes and ink in its place. But peace did not follow. His paranoia returned, whispering that even parchment could not forgive the unforgivable. He fled through flooded lands, hunted by fate, clutching treasures as if gold could bribe death itself. Disease crept upon him like a lover, feverish and merciless, a fitting reflection of his own corruption. When he died, the chronicles say his body bloated and blackened, as though hell had already claimed its due. The barons buried him in haste, and the people murmured that the earth itself refused his rest. Thus ended the reign of England's cruelest king, a man who mistook desire for destiny and found only decay. When John's coffin was sealed, England did not mourn, it exhaled, as if the nation itself had survived an assault. The bells that tolled his passing sounded more like warnings than prayers for the damned. Chroniclers wrote cautiously, disguising horror in metaphor, terrified that truth itself might resurrect his memory. They called him cruel, faithless, lecherous, yet none captured the true poison he left behind. His reign had taught England that lust could be political, that tyranny could wear the smile of desire. The Magna Carta, born from rebellion, became the world's first restraint against the sins of kings. Behind its noble clauses lay the ghosts of women silenced, of nobles humiliated, of servants broken by appetite. In every article of law against arbitrary power, John's shadow lingered like a scar upon parchment. Future monarchs learned to mask corruption with piety, fearing his legacy more than divine judgment itself. The Plantagenets rebuilt the monarchy on discipline and distance, turning cold restraint into the new face of royalty. But among the people, the legend of the cursed king only grew darker with each retelling. Minstrels sang of a monarch whose lust rotted his flesh, whose crown burned with the heat of sin. His name became a warning whispered in the courts of Europe, a lesson in unrestrained power. Even the church, once complicit, rewrote history to cleanse its own guilt of silence. They called him God's punishment, a reminder that no mortal, however crowned, could defy moral law forever. Centuries later, writers revived his image as villain, in sermons, in plays, in Shakespeare's ink of condemnation. But beneath the drama and myth, the truth remained more disturbing than fiction ever dared portray. John was not merely evil, he was human unrestrained, proof of what desire becomes without conscience. His cruelty shaped English politics, his scandal shaped its morality, and his downfall shaped its law. Through his sins, England discovered governance by limitation, a paradox carved from suffering and shame. The Magna Carta endured because it was born from trauma too great to be repeated. Even in ruins of his castles, archaeologists found traces of lavish excess beside remnants of torture. Each artifact whispered the same story, that civilization and savagery had once shared the same bed. And though his body decayed, his legend lived, feeding every story of kings who mistook lust for power. In every age since, rulers and tyrants alike have carried fragments of his curse in their ambitions. King John's reign became a mirror, forcing nations to see that corruption begins not in thrones, but in hearts. Centuries have passed, yet the stench of King John's sins still clings to the corridors of power. His story reminds us that lust, when fused with authority, becomes not passion, but policy. The faces have changed, the crowns replaced with suits and microphones, yet the hunger remains the same. In boardrooms, palaces, and parliaments, desire still whispers, where law dares not listen. Every scandal of the modern age echoes the same truth John proved. Control begins with temptation. Power seduces before it enslaves, and men fall not from weakness, but from the illusion of entitlement. History may record progress, but the human heart still kneels to the same dark gods. John's England was not an age, it was a warning dressed in royal silk. We still live beneath its echo, rewriting laws to restrain appetites older than civilization itself. Each era invents new justifications, but the core sin remains unchanged. Pleasure mistaken for dominion. From tyrants in castles to predators, behind screens, the psychology of control wears different masks. Yet the eyes never change. He was a king of the 13th century, but his ghost haunts every corridor where power meets desire. Even his death could not silence the lesson he embodied. That moral decay begins in private, not public. His tyranny ended with a tomb, but his legacy thrives in every scandal we pretend to forget. We build systems, write charters, and preach ethics, yet every age rediscovers the same corruption in new form. King John's story is not merely history, it is prophecy repeated through human weakness and willful blindness. The castles may have crumbled, but the pattern endures: lust, pride, ruin, and the quiet rewriting of truth. Each generation buries its own Johns, only to resurrect them in different uniforms and languages of power. He remains the mirror of mankind's oldest disease, to conquer the body before conquering the soul. And so his warning survives, carved, not in stone, but in conscience. No crown redeems what cruelty corrupts. Beneath every civilization lies the same temptation: to rule through pleasure, to justify tyranny as love. We may claim enlightenment, yet our empires still tremble before the same whispers that once ruled England. King John of England is long, dead, yet his hunger walks among us, wearing our faces, speaking our excuses. The past does not sleep. It watches, waiting to remind us that every age breeds its own cruel tyrant. And as long as desire governs reason, the line between king and monster will always remain perilously thin. So remember him, not as a relic of history, but as a reflection of everything power still dares to hide.